Hi everyone, I'm Malin and this is Love Zero Waste Live and the 1 month long scan of zero waste trends in Europe. We're collaborating with Zero Waste Europe and this week is the last one. This week is the finale where we are diving deep into our future health with or without plastics. With us today we have Susana Fonseca, a board member of Zero in Portugal. Welcome to Love Zero Waste Live, Susana.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So what's the situation of nano and microplastics in water bodies across and surrounding Europe?
Well, what we know, and this is an area where there's a lot we don't know, actually, because all the estimations are usually have big intervals because we don't have a clear idea. But what is in the official documents is that around 174,000 tons of microplastics get into the water bodies every year, just in Europe. But we just recently found out, for example, in the news that even the when we feed our babies with I don't recall the name in in English, with when you cannot breastfeed and you have to use other objects. I don't remember the name in English.
Substitutes?
No. The recipient that you use to put the milk.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Called
like a bottle thing.
Yeah, because in Portuguese it's biberão, but I don't know how it is in English. And they've just realized that there's millions and of microplastics being released just from the use of these bottles, feeding bottles. So it's really scary, I would say, what we are finding out about microplastics being around us everywhere, and so not only affecting the water bodies, but even our body. Just imagining that every day we are ingesting microplastics, and it's really a huge problem because some of the sources of microplastics are intentional, and therefore we can do something on that, like on detergents, on cosmetics, paints, so inks. So there's a few products that we can actually work with in the sense of trying to avoid this inclusion of intentional microplastics. But there is a huge world of microplastics being produced unintentionally. When we use a car, when we use, for example, recycled tires on football pitches, when we wash our clothes, with microfibers. So it's really kind of overwhelming. It's everywhere, like it's omnipresent. And it is a serious problem in the sense that we don't know exactly the impact, but it is for sure that as a human being, we are not used to our bodies. And even our other species, of course, not only for humans, it is important, but also for other species. Our bodies, our organisms are not used to deal with this kind of pollutant. And therefore, in many cases, these kind of microplastics also bring other kind of substances, endocrine disruptors, for example, heavy metals. There's a lot of impacts that can come from microplastics that are still not well known and not well studied. And it's almost in some cases, it's very difficult to have this clear perspective of the impact. And therefore, as an environmental NGO, we would definitely defend the precautionary principle and that we should try as much as we can to avoid the introduction of microplastics into the environment, water bodies, soil, whatever. And for that, we do need a more concerted action at the European level, at the national level also. But the brands also have to work a lot in terms of in research to avoid this huge release of microplastics, because microplastics, once there, we can talk about the plastic island and all the plastic that we find in nature. But the truth is, with microplastics, it's far more difficult to remove them. Yeah. So once they're there, it's almost impossible to get them out. And that's even more concerning because they are really everywhere nowadays.
But looking
at
yeah,
the rain, it's everywhere.
It seems to be so like a big blob of a problem that we mainly don't see or understand. But looking at like what's intentional and unintentional of like the release of micro and nanoplastics in water bodies, for example, how could we then become more aware of the unintentional practices? What can we do in that end?
Well, now we already know that there are some sources that they've been identified, but it is, I mean, but that's why I started with the intentional, because those are the ones we can try to work more and have results more fastly and more in the present. Because for the unintentional, for example, of course, we are discussing research in order, for example, to make textiles more resistant to releasing microfibers. If we use natural fibers, of course, they might release fibers, but they are natural, and so they'll biodegrade more easily, which is okay. Although we shouldn't buy so many clothes as we do now. That's another area. Yeah. We should reuse more. So there are areas where but when you go, for example, for tires, you know that the abrasion when you use a car or even a bicycle, of course, a car is much more heavier, so the release is higher. But how can you control? I mean, you should use more public transportation, but it's more structural. So in order to prevent these unintentional microplastics, you have to have a more structural approach and sometimes change practices of people, of companies, etc. We do have to rethink some areas so that we can, I wouldn't say avoid totally, but to reduce the amount of microplastics that we are introducing into the environment in any circumstance. Mm-hmm. So it depends on the area. Each area has its own. Let's say you have to do research in each of these areas, because there are many and they are different. But for example, there are these on the intentional sources. You can do a lot. I mean, there's a lot of pellets being released by the industry, the plastic industry. So these are the kind of things that you can stop. In this case, I would say stop, not just reduce. I mean, stop. Finding ways to really stop these releases to the environment. I mean, in cosmetics, in inks, and there's so many other areas where you actually are integrating microplastics, and you should really avoid those. I mean, at least those, because they're also in the thousands of tons every year. So you should work also on that. The unintentional probably will take us a little bit longer to address, because they're more difficult and are so interrelated sometimes with our day-to-day life that it's complicated. But of course, if we stop releasing plastic to the environment, I mean, even the microplastic, the packaging, whatever, of course, that will also contribute to reducing the amount of microplastics that we see around, because some microplastics really come from the degradation of bigger plastics. And so the more we reduce the introduction in the environment of plastic, the better will be, or easier, it will be easier to reduce the presence of microplastics in our environment, particularly in water.
But then you mentioned microplastics seeping into our bodies from like bottles. It could also be like from what we eat. Mm-hmm. How does it impact life on Earth, and in particular our health?
Well, that's what we don't know. I recall a study, I think it was published in Nature, the scientific magazine, related to the impact of microplastics and some of the pollutants they transport with them into a bacteria that in the ocean that exists in the ocean, and it's responsible for, I think, 10% of the oxygen produced every year. And the presence of microplastics kind of reduced the activity of these bacteria. Which means that they would produce less oxygen. and so I just use this example to show that there is so many possible interactions that we are not looking at, so it's so that we do know very little of the impacts of microplastics, but because we know very little, in our perspective, we should be very precautious in terms of how we deal with them and not think, we don't have signs that they will impact our health or the health of the ecosystems. But we would do it the other way around, because the first studies that are appearing, that are studying actually the impact of these microplastics in our balance in our ecosystem, really showed that they can have a huge impact. Who thinks about this bacteria that it's in the ocean and it's producing oxygen for us, for all of us? I didn't know that they exist until I read the magazine. And so there's so many interactions that might be already occurring that we are not aware of, that we really should try to so not knowing is not the same of not doing harm. Harm can already be done, can already be in place and happening, even if we don't know about it. And it's this, as I said, so this omnipresence, the fact that you find microplastics everywhere in the air, in the rain, in the soil, in the waters, in the food, in our own bodies. So it's really, for me, concerning. Particularly because in some cases, as you said very well, Malin, some of them are nanoplastics. So it's nanoparticles, I would say. So, and we do have also that's a very contentious area also, the impact of nanoparticles in our bodies and also in the environment, because we really don't have, in many cases, the way to study their impact and the fact that they are so small, so they can cross barriers that exist in our bodies to protect us from certain invaders, let's say. And one
That's
is related
scary.
even to our brain. Yeah. So, but that happens with nanoparticles, all nanoparticles, I would say. So nanoplastics, it's just another element. But we are also seeing an increased use of nanoparticles in many uses that people are not aware of. And including now with the pandemics and disinfection and etc. And we haven't thoroughly studied the impact of these substances that can be quite different from the impact they have when they are in a bigger structure. So nanoparticles, even if they are the same, let's say, substance, that a larger molecule, they can have different impacts due to their size. And so it's really concerning. So the smaller, I would say, the more concerning, because microplastics can already be easily ingested by different species. But if they, besides these microplastics, we have also nanoplastics. I mean, they cannot only be absorbed and ingested, but actually they can get into our bodies more easily, into our cells, and so I'm not saying that is happening. I'm just saying that it is a potential hazard, and we should be really aware and not wait too long to act, because what we feel sometimes is that since we start discussing this until we act in some cases, the cases that we can actually act already, it takes so long that it makes it, you just drag your feet and the problem goes on and goes on. And again, I mean, microplastics, once they're there, they are very difficult to remove. So we should really.
But since it seems to be such a big area which is unknown in terms of the impacts or the effects, how can we take action that's in the proper size of taking action to help the future to become less affected by the micro and nanoplastics?
But I mean, if you want me to speak about the citizens' action or a more broader perspective?
It could be in a broader perspective.
Okay, so we are now in the process of restricting microplastics. So ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, has a process of to restrict intentional uses of microplastics, but for example, we are following that discussion, although in Europe, some other NGOs are following it much more closely, because it takes a lot of technical knowledge to follow these discussions at this level when it gets to a restriction. dossier, but so what we see is derogations everywhere. So even for those uses that you actually know that they're intentional and there are alternatives, there's a lot of derogations being discussed. And so again, from our point of view, there is no clear vision of the urgency of this action. Although, of course, the restriction dossier is already a good sign. they've realized that we do have a problem. So it's not always that we have these kind of dossiers. But then, of course, you have all these interests from companies and even sometimes from some countries, and that are just postponing the action, which is a terrible situation and a bad example. But of course, it is good that we are in this process. So we have a lot of information also because of it, because it had to be collected for justifying the restriction, and that is very good. And of course, there are discussions already happening. I mean, in some sectors on how they can, and some research being done on how that, as I said, for example, in textiles, to avoid such releases of fibers. There's been discussed also solutions for machines or washing machines that kind of retain particles, these microplastics, sorry. And so that could also be, in some cases, a solution, but mostly for bigger, let's say, microfibers, not the nano microfibers. It's very difficult to catch them in a net or something, or a filter. Of course, in football pitches, there's also a lot of discussion on the need for substituting the use of recycled rubber for other materials, more natural and biodegradable materials. So I think there is some hope in the sense that there's a lot of discussion already going on. Even for tires, it's already being discussed. If we can somehow make it reduce, if you can somehow reduce the emissions. Nothing is on the ground yet. I mean, nothing concrete, but it's being worked on. And so I would say for citizens, I think what they can is clearly so buy less textiles, try to use natural fibers. When they buy detergents, try to buy with an eco label, which usually do not contain microplastics. But anyway, if you want to be sure, you want to use some other detergent or something, just ask the producer for more information. Even if he doesn't answer you directly, if he's not obliged to, of course, in terms of a good relationship, he should, but it will be a form of pressure, so that they will understand that people are being more aware, more concerned, and that they do not want that kind of substance in their product, in the product they are buying and they are using every day. The same for cosmetics. So we should use as the least as possible, and then of those you do use, then you should. Well, of course, you can do your own if you have those skills and you're inclined to do it. Of course, that's a good way to avoid microplastics. But you can also look for brands that clearly state that they do not use, or that if they are eco-labeled, that can also give us some reassurance that not only on microplastics, but even on other areas, it's a more sustainable brand and a more sustainable product.
So then to help in the progress, we need some sort of like a call for action towards refusing both the intentional and unintentional release of micro and nanoplastics.
Because it's always fundamental. So we at Zero in Portugal, we work mainly on policy advocacy, but for us it's much more easier to advocate for certain ideas, proposals, if we do have a large percentage of the population aware of the problem and asking for change. That's what happened with plastics. So we have the SOUP directive, the single-use plastics directive, in a it went through a fast process because there was this clear perspective by politicians that society generally, I mean, from researchers to opinion makers to citizens, I mean, the surveys done at the European level, Eurobarometer, was very clear that people wanted action. So, of course, this ground roots movement and making noise around it, it's very, very important to make the causes advance more rapidly. Of course, we do not like to put the pressure or the responsibility on the citizens and consumers, because in many cases, and in these cases, they don't have that much power. I mean, they have power, but they cannot change structurally the things directly. Of course, with their pressure, they can help, but so we should put the pressure where it's right, which is on the producers, on politicians, to create the let's say the right regulatory environment to push for changes by producers so that consumers can benefit from those changes. But all this is much easier when consumers are aware and they are doing noise around any issue that we are working on.
That's a beautiful wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us, Susana Fonseca, board member of Zero in Portugal.